Thanks, Jane. I first want to acknowledge CanSim and the co-presidents that are online with us today. So thank you so much to Dr. Jane Tyerman from the University of Ottawa and Dr. Marianne Lefleude from the from Queen's University. We'll get started here with our presentation today, and welcome to all of you who are online with us, and to all of you who may be joining us at a later time, as this will be recorded. It's my absolute pleasure to be introducing to you our speaker today. Laura Killam is an innovative nurse educator who is committed to transforming nursing education. She believes in student-centered approaches to education that are psychologically safe and dialogue-based. Her developing program of research is an authentic assessment, which aims to align graded components of courses with real-world context. More specifically, as a PhD in nursing student at Queen's University, she is focused on exploring diverse student perspectives of co-creation within assessment. Co-creation means sharing decision-making power with the students instead of dictating course design. Through inviting students to make decisions about their assessments, it fosters their evaluative judgment and critical thinking, essential skills for practice in real-world settings. Laura is working with her supervisor, Dr. Marianne Lefleude, and the Canadian Alliance of Nurse Educators using simulation, or as we all know it, CanSim, to improve student experiences of co-creation of interprofessional virtual online poverty challenge simulations. And so welcome, Laura. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm so excited to be sharing my experiences today and my work as a PhD student at Queen's University. I am situating this presentation inside of my work with Queen's University, even though I am talking about my practice as a nurse educator in Northern Ontario. So for those of you that may be aware of the current college labor relations, I have checked that this presentation is not struck work and it's okay for me to be doing this. Before I will begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the beautiful land that surrounds me and its history. I'm situated on the traditional lands of the Robinson-Huron Treaty, and acknowledge our hosts, the Atikamekw, Anishinaabe people, as well as our ancestors of this land, the Anishinaabe people. It feels a little strange to be up here presenting about this by myself, because this really is a group effort. I have so many acknowledgements that I can give. CanSim for the ongoing development of high quality simulations and professional development materials. I wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing today without them, as well as past students. In fact, the theme for this presentation was chosen by students who presented with me at eCampus Ontario's test conference. And they chose this theme because they said to them, the circles represent the non-hierarchical nature of the course when everyone is working together to support each other. I'd also like to thank current students. I have a couple of them in the room today, which brings a little bit of joy to my heart. And all the students in the class that are working with me on this journey in the course. Many community partners, guest speakers, and people that have reviewed my syllabus. Even my syllabus is not an effort of myself alone. I've had faculty teaching other courses have input on the syllabus and the questions that I ask students on exams, so that my course is not a standalone course. And of course, my PhD committee, who has really helped me understand in more depth the theory that underlines the practices that I am doing in the class. I've dropped into the chat my references, a copy of the slides in case anyone wants to follow along, as well as a not live version of my syllabus. In this presentation, I plan to provide an overview of two main ways that I've used CanSim materials in one course. I'm going to start with an overview of some of the theories that inform why I designed the course in the way that I did, and provide a brief overview of the course, and then I'll talk through some of the specific strategies used. First, I want to talk about how I embedded completion of virtual simulations into the course, which I think any educator can adapt in pretty much any course. After that, I'm going to talk through how, as an educator, I support students who are engaging in completing virtual games, as well as creating games in the class. There's going to be a little bit more theory in this section, and in both cases, I'm going to reflect on the strengths, challenges, and evolving opportunities that are happening inside of the class. You can feel free to put questions in the chat as we go, although I might have to get to those when we get towards the end. This right here is the situation that I want to avoid. I do not want to be the teacher that is controlling everything, just throwing knowledge into the minds of students. In the 1970s, Paulo Freire critiqued the prevailing notion in education that educators should be positioned as experts to control the information that is then put into student minds. When we position teachers as experts that control all aspects of learning, and we rely on lecture and tests for the purposes of seeing if students have retained the knowledge that we've put into their brains, it creates a situation where learners are passive and disempowered. They're not encouraged to think for themselves. Students may memorize information, regurgitate it on an exam without really understanding it, and forget the information soon after the exam. In this approach, students typically have a hard time taking what they've learned in school and applying it to their work outside of school. And we wonder why students have a hard time applying knowledge in the clinical setting. Several scholars throughout history have advocated for education that moves away from the idea of filling student minds with facts towards education that prepares students to function in the real world through asking them to find, reflect on, and evaluate information in a rapidly changing world. In my abstract, I talked about sources of oppression. In a traditional classroom, oppression may occur from educators using power over students in a variety of ways. Learners are judged or scored based on how well they can recall or apply information in a manner that the educator says is correct. I don't think that educators intentionally oppress students, but I think it occurs because of how we are trained to educate and a lack of time for critical reflection on our own practices. In a traditional classroom, the educator is positioned as the expert and may dislike being questioned about the accuracy of their exams. Instead, transparent grading of assignments and helping a student understand how they are being evaluated reduces oppression. We can also work to break down this power differential in other ways in our classroom. In the traditional classroom, all decision-making power and grading power rests with the educator. When educators decide not to provide a clear outline for tests or assignments, it causes fear and anxiety among students. It is possible to share decision-making power with students in small ways, such as providing flexibility with due dates, or in larger ways, like I'll talk about a little bit later today. Sometimes educators are unkind or inflexible with students and treat them as if they are inferior. When this happens, it creates a situation in which students are afraid to ask questions and may even make them feel justified for unkind behavior towards their educators. It doesn't matter what kind of assignments educators are using, we should all be kind to students. Critical thinking is suppressed when traditional testing is overused in academia, especially when the questions are not written to test critical thinking. Students need to be encouraged to ask questions and do more than just recall information. When we focus on memorization of facts, it's highly problematic because in the real world, students need to be able to apply and use the information that they have learned. Sorry, I just need a drink. The educational system might also feel oppressive for educators. Unfortunately, educators who feel oppressed are more likely to oppress their students. I'm going to use some soft language here because I recognize that what I'm talking about is not necessarily going to apply to all settings. The educational system is facing challenges from being chronically underfunded. Educators keep being pushed to do more with less in the classroom, with larger classes, and no reduction in teaching loads. Increasing expectations in the classroom are accompanied by increasing expectations outside of the classroom to engage in service and research. In some situations, faculty feel micromanaged. Together, these factors lead to faculty feeling overworked and burning out. On top of all of that, we lack time and/or financial support for training and professional development. When we get hired, we need to have nursing knowledge, but there's no universal requirement to be trained in how to teach. It ends up being left to our own self-directions and self-directedness to learn how to be a good teacher. Systematic oppression in nursing education is unfortunately a widespread issue. And those of you that were at the Canadian Association of Schools of Nursing workshop this morning, we talked about this widespread issue, and it's led to incivility and inflexibility among educators. Incivility exists between students, in learner-educator relationships, and between faculty and managers. There are many possible reasons for this inappropriate behavior in the literature, but one thing is certain: it needs to stop. Paulo Freire said that for change to happen, it needs to come from those that are oppressed. That means we need to be pushing for this change to happen. And we can start changing the system by sharing power that we have with students and giving them the skills to challenge oppression in the classroom and in society. There are many kinds of critical pedagogy that center around the idea of learner empowerment. The one that I identify most with is critical caring pedagogy, because it integrates the caring focus of nursing with critical pedagogy. We expect students to graduate and become caring practitioners because nursing is a caring profession. Therefore, we need to role model caring in education. In a nutshell, educators using critical caring pedagogy role model caring, inclusivity, and authenticity in ways that help students become independent practitioners. It's more extensive than what I've shown on the screen here, and I encourage you to read more about it if you're interested. For today, I've selected a few aspects of the framework that actively guide my assignment design, because we're talking about assignment design today. Within critical caring pedagogy, educators can role model caring through actions such as engaging students in dialogue, building their professional capacity, exhibiting flexibility, and helping trusting relationships with their students. In critical caring pedagogy, the focus is on learning and not grades, and how educational activities, including assignments, align with real-world practice. Which brings me to my developing program of research on something called authentic assessment. In authentic assessment, learners must use higher order thinking to solve real life or simulated problems in realistic conditions. Critical caring pedagogy and authentic assessment align very well because both are focused on preparing nursing students for real world work. You're probably doing authentic assessment already because simulation is one of the most common examples of authentic assessment. And I'm talking to the CanSim group. In authentic assessment, educators evaluate students in realistic and contextualized ways, meaning that they solve problems during assignments that they're likely to see in clinical practice. The tasks that they need to do in the assignment are similar to the tasks that they'll do after graduation, have appropriate levels of complexity, and help students learn to evaluate the quality of their work and the work of others. That's what we call evaluative judgment. If you're interested, I can send you a paper that I'm working on for my PhD that goes into more detail about this once it is finally published. Another framework that I am using to help me guide my decisions around the way I design courses is the Universal Design for Learning framework, often abbreviated as UDL. Basically, where it aligns with learning outcomes is a good idea to integrate some choice into learners' assignments because it's more inclusive and it supports diversity. There's a lot of discussion about how to support diversity, and choice is a good way to do that. Choices might include where an assignment is done, when an assignment is done, what resources students use to complete an assignment, and how students complete those assignments. For example, students right now are writing an exam for me, and they've been given the opportunity to respond to open-ended questions in multiple ways, such as using text, audio, or video. By giving students choices, it promotes accessibility and follows the UDL framework at the same time. It's basically the idea of planning for diversity in advance instead of reacting. This might be a good place to mention that if you're looking at my syllabus, you'll see that some of my deadlines are strict and others are called flexible deadlines. Flexible deadlines get automatically extended for a week if something is not submitted on time. This extension is automatic, which means that there's no need to request it. That reduces the number of emails that I get. And it's also very comforting for students, is what I've heard. I got this idea from a professor at the University of Waterloo, and I've been doing it since 2020. And students have anecdotally appreciated this flexibility. It's worked better than any other approach that I've used in the past to try and build agency into assignment deadlines because students can customize it. The course that I'm talking about today is a year 3 mandatory undergraduate nursing course. I'm in the second delivery of this course, and this year there's approximately 60 students. We had more students last year. It focuses on the empowerment of nursing students, individuals, families, communities, and the profession. In this class, I criticize oppression in education, healthcare, and society, actually using some of the theories that I talked about earlier. I begin with a statement of cultural humility. As a white, non-Indigenous, heterosexual teacher and working with others throughout the course, it helps me meet the learning objectives of the course. I work towards discussing the content, not necessarily a checkmark approach to covering all the content. I deliberately position myself as a discussion facilitator and not an expert in these topics to try and promote empowerment and open dialogue in the class. Each week, we focus on different groups of people that have been historically disadvantaged in society. I don't really like the term, but we call them marginalized groups in the class. For approximately 1 hour of class time, I've been bringing in guests to share their stories and/or research with students related to each of the groups that we've talked about. The weeks that are not listed on your screen right now are used primarily for the assignment that I'm going to talk about in the next section of this presentation. In the first section of the presentation, I'm going to talk about certificates and certificate completion. The institution that I teach at limits participation marks to 10% of the course grade. So I've got 10 certificates in 4 different groupings. The initial reflections that accompany those certificates are worth 10% of the course grade, and those are due at 8:30 in the morning the day of class, and class starts at 12:30 that day. The first group was on Indigenous peoples. Students have been given a choice because there were 2 through Cancer Care Ontario that were used last year, and then this year our Indigenous Services Centre wanted to have a second option for students because they like this a newer module that was developed. You guys, as part of CANSIM, may be familiar with the SOGI modules. Absolutely excellent resource, and students complete all 4 of the currently available certificates in this class and are also supposed to do the cultural humility section of the class. There's some others on equity access, which focus on barriers for persons with disability in healthcare, and then one on racism that's also part of something that's being developed through CANSIM right now as we speak, and I look forward to having more of those modules to work with my students. After students complete the 10 certificates and the initial reflections in those 4 different weeks, there is a final reflection, which I will talk about a little bit later. I don't really expect you to read what's on the screen, but it's just an example of something that somebody handed in. The initial reflections are designed to be really flexible and incorporate universal design for learning principles. Each group of certificates had discussion prompts that were created based on the Debriefing for Meaningful Learning framework and/or input from community stakeholders, and those are listed in the syllabus. The goal was to promote reflection and self-debriefing. The design was influenced by the CANSIM Facilitator Guide for Virtual Debriefing course. And I graded these very generous with a rubric that I actually think could be a little bit more generous, but students didn't want me to mess with it in the middle of the class. I asked for a written narrative with no page limit, but I told them that I expected a minimum of 1 page. Students usually submitted more than 1 page, and the reflections often deviated from the discussion prompts in the syllabus, which was okay as long as they demonstrated depth in their response. So the prompts really served as a starting point as opposed to dictating exactly how those reflections would be done. Marks were lost for superficial responses or late submissions because these initial reflections served as the basis for in-class debriefing, which I'll talk about a little bit later. It was great to review these. I got a lot of different variety from students. There's infographics, artwork, Dear Diary letters, newsletter style submissions, very deep and personal reflections, PowerPoints, and more. So marking them actually was quite enjoyable. And the grading was designed to be fairly quick, and it was quick. I'm going to put the bit.ly link in the chat for you guys to refer to if you want. I've taken out the details of what would be in a Google document, but basically I structured the course using this Google document, or the course discussion using this Google document, and then I would provide a summary of my observations or the themes that were discussed in the Google document. I set the expectation in advance that grading was going to be quick. I rarely made individualized comments on submissions, and then the themes were shared in that Google document. The debriefs typically lasted around an hour, although I let it eat up more of class time as long as we were talking about things that aligned with course learning objectives. I had guests help me facilitate 3 of the 4 debriefs. And I'm going to be honest with you, the first debrief was mostly them listening to elders, and we didn't use a Google document. Instead, I took some notes in a PowerPoint. And then the second one was mostly them responding to the question, what would you like to discuss? And there was a guest for that one, and students mostly asked the guest questions, which was okay. In their words, they needed to listen to that one. And then there was a breakthrough after that in week 4. And the next 2 debriefs were much more interactive. I'm not 100% sure why that breakthrough happened, but I feel like it has something to do with the fact that building relationships in a class takes a lot of time, and we needed to create that safe space for having those discussions. So some persistence, some honesty with students about my own views and context, and being open to multiple points of view, I think helped to have that breakthrough happen. That example that I shared with you in the bit.ly link was 7 pages long once we were done adding notes. So I don't record these debriefs, but I take decent notes, I believe, to promote accessibility for students. After all the certificates were done, students got to choose one aggregate or group of people to focus their final reflection on. The aggregate was not limited to the ones that were covered by the certificates, but it had to be a group of people that were historically disadvantaged in society. The assignment started as a video rant, which was an idea that other sites in my collaboration were using for a different assignment in this same class. And then in week 2 of the class, I asked students what they might want to change about the syllabus. Based on sharing decision-making power with those students, the time limit was made approximate for the video, and there was an essay option that was added. Students wanted to try and publish, and so the limits for the essay were based on the limits for whatever journal they were targeting, and I gave them a list of 4 that I thought were student-friendly. It's easy to integrate choice when I grade all work in any course based on Bloom's taxonomy, and my students are fairly familiar with me talking about Bloom's taxonomy and how I'm grading. So that made it easy for me to do different versions of an assignment where I am grading using the same marking guide. The marking guide is broad because I'm trying to avoid putting students in a box by being too prescriptive. I did have one student, however, share that they're trying to figure out exactly what I wanted. And so at the time, flexibility in assignment does make some students nervous. They're not exactly used to having as much control as I give them sometimes over assignments. This is a 10% assignment, so I feel like it's a little bit lower stakes and a good opportunity to build trust with students. This approach was new this year, and it was because of the professional development that I've done with CANSIM members, conferences, and reading about the importance of debriefing. There's 3 levels of debriefing in this course: self-debriefing in the initial reflections, in-class debriefing in the large group, and then debriefing again in the final reflections. I feel like this was much better than last year's essay submission approach, where students submitted all of the certificates for the class at the same time along with their overall reflection. Students have described it as liberating. When I was talking about making changes to the rubric, people thought that the way that it was designed gave people freedom to express themselves the way that they wanted to. And there was a sense that it improved relationships between students in the course and also between myself and the students in the course. I was nervous about using this approach because of scalability. I do think that the approach of providing the overall feedback instead of individual feedback helps a little bit with this. I don't know how large of a class it would be manageable to start grading the same week that you need to have the feedback done for by 12:30 on a specific day. It is hard for me to limit comments though, because I do want to provide more feedback and I do want to talk to the students. Our policy is a little bit limiting because I can only give participation grades for up to 10%. Although under opportunities, I do think I could make the case that this isn't strictly participation. I might be able to integrate more of these simulations because my students are asking for more. In particular, in relation to racism, they're asking for more. It worked well. I think it could be worked in a variety of courses and transferred to other contexts. So I hope to use this strategy wherever possible. And I'm looking forward to some feedback because I am in the middle of this and I haven't actually viewed the final reflections yet. And I hope that students' desire to publish is coming from their passion to change society and not some pressure that I'm unaware of in the class. So I'm interested in knowing more about why some students are choosing that option. And I might need to add more choice to that particular assignment. I'd like to move towards switching topics a little bit and talking about how students are actually now developing simulations in the course using the CAN-SIM process. I've called this co-created simulation development. So what do I mean by co-creation? We define co-creation as a process that occurs through shared decision-making power with students and engaging in student-educator collaboration. The goal is to empower students to shape course design. The definition on the screen is quoted from a publication that was co-authored with students. In my research and in our courses, co-creation was different than what I've seen in much of the literature because it involved all students in a course throughout the experience. Co-creation aims to get students out of that mindset that they are receivers of information and into the mindset where they're engaging in deep experiential learning through shared decision-making that helps them become active participants in shaping their own learning experiences. The basic idea is that learners can do more with expert help. Social interaction during learning with a mentor helps students reach their full potential and provides a frame for independent critical thinking. It also helps them develop the ability to plan and evaluate the quality of their own work. So if we look at this picture here in the green circle at the middle, that's Vygotsky's idea of what students can do on their own. It's kind of, I like to think about it as like sort of their comfort zone. So if we didn't help them with the assignment, that's what they could do. And then Vygotsky talked about the idea of pushing students into the zone of proximal development by supporting them through working with an expert. So what they can accomplish through co-creation is actually more than what they can accomplish by themselves. And then of course, there's the zone around the outside where students are unable to do that stuff, even if they were assisted. So the idea is that by partnering with students during simulation development, they can accomplish more and they can learn more and they can develop faster. I don't really like the idea of positioning myself as an expert in this class, but I do have group facilitation skills and some simulation development experience that is quite helpful for this particular project. There are many reasons to engage in co-creation. When teachers rely primarily on traditional approaches to education, like lecture, students have a hard time feeling engaged with their learning because they're seen as passive recipients of knowledge. In our test presentation, students speak to these points on your screen more. But in the interest of time, I'm going to skim over the introduction to why co-creation is a good idea. The main point is that our graduates need to develop the cognitive skills to function in a rapidly evolving world, and co-creation helps them do that. Nursing students in this same course are currently working with students in another program to make the simulations using the CAN-SIM development process. This project is also an interprofessional learning experience. I'm not the only educator that's co-creating with these students. Melanie, her picture's on the screen, and I work together to support the students. The Community and Health Services Navigation Program is all about supporting people to navigate health and social justice systems. There's good alignment between the learning outcomes of the two courses. And my first question, whenever I go to a presentation about innovative assignments, and I think this one's innovative, is how large is your class? Together with the two classes, we have approximately 90 students, and we've divided those students into 15 groups. Each group has 6 students. Typically, that's 2 navigation students and 4 nursing students because the navigation program is smaller than the nursing program. The goal of this project is to encourage experiential learning for students in relation to the lived experiences of persons facing poverty and to co-create virtual poverty challenge simulations, which may potentially be reused in future courses. There are many non-traditional aspects to the assignment that are aimed at helping students learn important skills that are needed for working professionals. Right now, students are actively engaged in the course content, seeking information about the lived experiences of people living in poverty from community agencies, learning about each other's roles in the healthcare system through interprofessional education, and they're tailoring the assignment to create lasting and meaningful learning experiences for them. The assignment is broken down into the 3 components on your screen. There's also a preparatory phase where students met each other, reviewed examples, and set up group work expectations. We're in the simulation co-creation phase now, and students will debrief through both individual reflective journals and small group debriefing. The actual individual reflective journal prompts will also be co-created with students, and that's happening in the future, but there are 4 general areas that we've said that we want the journal reflections to cover. This is different than last year. So if you're looking at our publication with students from last year, the schedule looks different. We've started earlier based on last group's feedback, and we've allocated a lot of time to actually working through the project together in class. We're also available outside of class time to meet with students whenever it is that they need it. Here's an overview of the technology that we're using in the class. So Melanie and I use email and Teams to communicate with each other. We have a folder for our guide documents, slides, and a folder for each group of students. Last year, we graded the simulations inside of Teams using a shared document with the marking guide for each group, where we could both add comments and discuss the grade together before we then released it to students, which we plan to do again this year. We use Moodle as our learning management system, and we have separate course shells for each of our courses, but then a shared course shell for this project that has all of the students in it. Each group has access to their own section of Moodle with a discussion board and a link to the shared folder with the files that they need to complete the simulation. Their shared folder is synced with the folder inside of our team. We couldn't add them to Teams because of institutional limitations. This folder is also synced with my computer, so I have all their files on my computer. Some groups have moved these documents into Google Documents to do the in-progress work because they prefer Google for collaborative editing, and I kind of don't blame them. We use Zoom and shared documents for large class activities, and we prepare guide documents in advance of each class and then use breakout rooms to help to give students time to work in their groups on the project. Melanie and I then circulate between the rooms and have a shared document where we talk to each other about group progress and where groups may need our help. That helps us go to the right breakout room where we're most useful. Students signed confidentiality agreements inside of Moodle before being given access to use any of the CANSIM templates through a quiz. Marion, Jane, and I talked through modifications from the one that you would have signed if you've done the CANSIM virtual simulation game design workshop to make it more appropriate for use in this course with students. For example, we simplified some of the language and we made it so that sharing back with CANSIM is not forced on students unless they choose to share their simulation outside of the course. Students also do not get to use the articulate storyline template. We're not going to ask them to spend that much. This is a screenshot of how the shared Moodle shell is organized. We reorganized it in week 2 of the course based on student feedback because initially it was harder for students to find information. Only people who are part of each group can access the group section of Moodle, but everyone can access the background information, simulation section, instructions, resources, class recordings, and the section that has large group discussions and examples. Here's a screenshot of how we've organized instructions and resources, and links are shared under each heading to the activities for that week. This is so there is no group 16, but this is a screenshot of what it would look like inside of the groups. There's contact information at the top, so obviously I wasn't going to share that in a presentation. Students can discuss the assignment in the discussion board with each other, and after they complete that confidentiality and copyright agreement, they can click on the link to the folder, which takes them to the development files. The shared folder is the one that I mentioned earlier that Melanie and I also have inside of our teams, which which is then synced to our computers. If you've done the CanSim virtual simulation game design workshop, you have access to the same Word templates listed on your screen and more. We chose the ones that we wanted the students to use. At this point in the term, students have worked through the case summary and learning outcomes with our help, and are now gathering information. We made the learning outcomes assessment rubric optional, but have told students that it would be helpful to complete. We will help them with their decision point map in a future class, and we'll be grading the script along with the final simulation. Above the script, we're asking students to insert the development team names, finalized case summary, and learning outcomes. Which with each decision point, we've asked students to list the learning outcome number that the decision point aligns with. That's going to help us with the grading. And the simulation template document 5 on your screen was made by students last year and is available in our publication if anyone's interested in checking that out. However, if you have access to Articulate Storyline or H5P, I personally would just use that. I think making a simulation in there is better because the end product will work a little bit better and you can visualize the process a little more effectively inside of those programs. This is a screenshot of the examples section of the shared Moodle shell. Students can review projects from last year, as well as completed CanSim documents for a game that I had the privilege of working with to develop with CanSim. And we've provided examples, providing examples is supported by literature to visualize what success looks like. And I can't remember if it was critical caring pedagogy, it probably was, or if it was authentic assessment, it probably was. It's probably in both, that it's actually a good idea to give students examples because it gives them somewhere to start. This is a slide from our presentation to them in week 2. After the project is complete, students can choose if they want to share their simulations outside of the course or not. Sharing is absolutely not required. No one's choosing to use H5P, and I don't blame them because at our institution anyways, it's a little complicated to give students edit access to H5P. So I think students are probably going to lean towards Google Slides. Some of them might be using PowerPoint, which is the one that we've recommended because it's all synced in our folders then. And I have one group that I'm talking to right now about using Articulate Storyline. Obviously, I'll be doing the assembly for that. So the simulations are co-created. Again, co-creation means that we're making decisions together about how the assignment looks and how it is graded. That means that educators help the groups work through the CanSim templates. They're not left to do it by themselves. It also means that we're open to changing the marking guide. In fact, we just made a change to it last week, which I was very happy with. The debriefing prompts for individual reflective journals are going to be co-created, and students will embed reflection prompts in the simulations that they're creating. And then later in the course, we're going to set expectations as a large group during week 10 for what those journals look like. Those journals are new this year for nursing students, but the navigation students actually did them last year. And they were added for all students based on feedback from last year's group. So this is, I just need to slow this down to make it very clear. So a group is going to create a simulation. Students are assigned to complete a simulation then that their peers created before completing the individual reflective journals and moving into the debrief portion of the assignment. This is an example of what the debriefing schedule might look like. The debriefing schedule is made, it doesn't look exactly like this, but basically that's the idea. Debriefing is where the magic happened last year, and I'm really looking forward to it happening again this year. As a group, students will facilitate a discussion-focused debrief with assigned students from class, which means they're working in small groups. They're not debriefing the entire class. For example, group 2 will complete the simulation that group 1 created. Group 1 will then debrief group 2. And then the flip will happen. Students are graded based on their objectives for the debrief, reflection questions guided by a debriefing framework, audience engagement, and content coverage. Students also get individual marks for participating in the debrief. This is a screenshot from inside of the course where you can see that students are encouraged to complete the CanSim debriefing module before they make their simulation, and especially before they are leading the debrief. I've talked about this module when debriefing their certificates in class, therefore role modeling what debriefing looks like during the course. This resource is very important for the course, and I thank CanSim very deeply for it. Personally, I've done this several times. I think I've done it like 3 or 4 times now because I get different value from it each time that I do it. some beginning reflections is that I think that this is much better this year now that we're using the CAN-SIM process than it was last year. It's a bit more streamlined. There is deep learning happening. I can see it already with my students, some of the comments that they're making about how fragmented the healthcare system is for helping people who are living in poverty. And I anticipate that this is going to have a lasting impact. I know it did for last year's group because I taught them in the September term and they were still talking about, remember the poverty challenge? Remember what we learned from that? And so that's the kind of thing that I'm looking for. There are definitely some challenges. Class size is always an issue when you're trying to do very interactive things, and groups, no surprise, are dealing with group process issues. Communication could always be better. This assignment has uncertainty and frustration embedded into it, and it's time consuming. I'm not sure that we have the technology 100% right. I think if I had to redo it, I would really love to use Google, but that's against the rules at our school. So I might use OneDrive instead of Teams, just because I thought students would be able to sync the folder, but because students are blocked from being part of our teams, they can't sync the folder to their devices. I do think that it is a great opportunity for students to buy into their assignments because their assignments could have impact beyond the class. I feel like I need to do a better job teaching self-assessment in that first week of the class. That was brought to my attention by my people at Queen's. And I'm looking forward to thinking about how this type of thing might be able to be used in other courses. Okay. I feel like the assignment was a huge success last year. Before we started using the CAN-SIM process, this is an overview of some of the themes from the test presentation. I think it's even better this year. Some things that stood out to me is that students were learning through how the professors acted with them. And I often heard them talk about what they learned in this course in the future, in future courses, demonstrating that the project had a lasting impact on students. Back to those group process issues, it is a difficult project and we are pushing students outside of their comfort zone on purpose, but it's still uncomfortable for students. Group work is also often problematic, and we're working very hard as teachers to try and help students through group dynamic issues, which is a little bit time consuming, but I think it's worth it. It helps to build rapport among students, and we're trying to help them gather information. At the same time, I think that there's a lot of successes that we can celebrate because of that deep learning. And to me, as long as the focus stays on learning and not grades, I've had to have discussions with my students often that if we focus on learning, the grades will come. If we're focusing on learning, I think that we can continually reflect as educators on ways to improve this. As an educator, it's not the easiest assignment to implement. You need to break down the power differential in order for it to be successful, and that takes time. This class, I feel like that took until week 4. Class size does make a difference, but I do feel like it's possible in larger classes. I like to think that I typically teach 70 students, sorry. I call that a large class. I think I could do it in a larger group too, but it would need a high level of organization on the teacher's part and technological skills. I think that appropriate use of technology is really important, and we need to support our students in that. I feel like as an educator, I need to be super transparent in my processes, what I know, what I don't know, what I'm best to help students with, and what Melanie or her students are best to help students with. And some students may choose not to co-create with the educator, and that's okay. I feel like I have more groups this year co-creating with us than we did last year. I'm not sure why that is, but some students chose to do the project on their own, and some students last year had very high requisite technical skills. So maybe that had something to do with it. All right, let's talk. I am looking forward to any questions or comments that you have. If you don't, I have more slides to fill the time. So, Valerie, I see your hand up.
Yes, and I'm just trying to start my video. So terrible when you're, not used to the, I'm used to Teams, not Zoom. Anyway, I'll just go with my verbal.
Okay.
So thank you. It was a great presentation. And, certainly one of the challenges I identified as you were talking were similar to what you identified at the end. And one of the things I wonder about I find in particular right now, students are really struggling with a lack of uncertainty. And if anything changes on the learning plan, they're in a tizzy about that. So how have you gotten around that? Students being able to feel okay with uncertainty, and then making departures of, what's in the learning plan. Because I know certainly that's a big no-no in my world.
It's a no-no in my world too. So I've been working within the limitations of my institution for years, trying to figure out the best way to do this. Typically, if changes are made earlier in the semester, it's better than if changes are made later in the semester. So usually I like to make the changes in the first 2 weeks of class. This year, that didn't happen because I don't feel like students were comfortable enough telling me what they wanted changed in the first 2 weeks of the class. I feel like they needed until week 4 to feel comfortable telling me this part is not okay. When we made the changes, I feel like I'm going to get in trouble if the students are not, if some students feel unhappy with it, like that's when the appeals and all that stuff are going to start coming. So the change that I'm talking about that happened went from you must get interview proof from agencies to you must show proof of realism, such as interview proof or lived experience or whatever. So I was not adding stress to them. I was taking stress away. And I feel like if we're making changes to make the project more realistic for students to complete, no one's going to complain. Therefore, I'm not going to get in trouble. If I was to go the other way, I feel like that's where I would get in trouble with making the changes. Also, I baked the expectation that the syllabus was going to change into our course outline, which is the contract with students. So it's right in the course, this is probably going to change. And it's called co-creation, and I've told them up front. So students are well aware that these things are going to be figured out. Some of these things are going to be figured out as we go along. But that's an excellent question. Uncertainty in the middle of a pandemic is not a student's favorite thing.
Thanks, Laura.
You're welcome. It's a great question. Are there questions? And people can pipe in too if they want to. Comments are also acceptable. Caitlin.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I hopped on a little bit late, but I really enjoyed it. So thank you. I was wondering how you coached or trained the students, and maybe you addressed this, but I'm curious a little bit more detail maybe about how you coached or trained the students around debriefing, because I feel like that's something that can go really well or really be challenging, particularly if learners are not used to analyzing their work in quite through that lens, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I feel like last year I was a little bit more advantaged than I am this year because I taught them the course in the semester before, which is about how to teach. So I was able to set them up a little bit better. This year I am heavily relying on the CanSim training for debriefing, which is already linked in the course, which I've encouraged students to do, which is the thing that taught me how to do debriefing. Also, this year, I did a better job than last year, role modeling debriefing. So we've had 4 weeks where we've spent an hour or more in class with me co-facilitating or facilitating a debrief with a large group of students. And I've tried to create a safe space where my students are working in groups of 6 to debrief 6 students. They're not debriefing like I am 60 students at a time. So I feel like that's a little bit safer. I'm also there to help them if they need any feedback as they're getting prepared to do that debrief. And the marking guide in this case is actually a rubric, which is a little bit more prescriptive, which gives them a little bit more structure. So that rubric is not something that we're co-creating. And so it's a little bit more like, here's the path to success. Caitlin, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
It does. I'm a relatively new member to CanSim, so I'll be honest, I'm not as familiar with their debriefing training, but I've done debriefing training through other simulation programs. And there's like a lot of like meta cognitive learning that can happen for students when they're, as they say, debriefing with good judgment with their peers. So that was a good answer. Thank you.
And I can maybe add a little bit more for you, Caitlin, on the debriefing module. So it's a 2-hour faculty development module for debriefing, and it talks a little bit, it kind of goes through the process of where does debriefing come from? What's the purpose of it? What are the attributes of a good facilitator? And then it uses debriefing for meaningful learning as a framework. And it goes and explains that model, and then actually embeds a simulation where the facilitator is following DML. And there's also a game that goes in it. So CANSIM is really dedicated to providing faculty development resources. And one of the things that we're seeing is a lack of debriefing. So just as Laura had indicated, that debriefing, and you have also, that debriefing is essential here. So I think it'll be a great resource, and we're going to be extending that into Pearls and a few other models to support educators in delivering high quality debriefing.
Great. Thank you so much for expanding on that. I really appreciate it.
No problem. We just have some live transcripts turned on as a request from one of the participants. So are there any other questions? Because I kind of have one. So Laura,
Yeah.
for the marking, one of the things that I'm always taxed with from students is I have to provide a certain percentage prior to the drop date. So how do you separate the marking and allocation that way?
Excellent question. So the first 10% of the course is initial certificate completion, which students have all done now, and they have that 10% in. The next 10% of the course is the reflection, the rants, or if they're writing for publication, the essay that they're doing. So that's going to be 10%. I didn't talk about the fact there's an exam in the class. So there's a 30% exam, and I will have 50% of the course grade in before that add drop date by the time that they've finished their exam. Oh, also, since I'm now talking about the exam, students last year used their knowledge from the poverty challenge for their research project in the 4th year class that I taught. And that simulation that they developed as a very small simulation is on their exam as a case study that students this year are analyzing. So they get to see an example of a simulation on their exam too, which I thought was really neat. But all that to say, they will have 50% of their grade in before the add drop date from the exam, the certificate completion with initial reflections, and then the rant that they're doing.
Great. Excellent. No, that's really good, because that's always a challenge when you're building those pieces together to make sure that they have that feedback. So wonderful. Does anyone else have any questions? This is such an innovative use of the CANSIM, and a lot of really interesting ways of collaborating and bringing it all together. So I think this is awesome. You just put it in the chat if you have a question. I'm just going to quickly look at the chat to make sure. And please look at Laura's resources that she has put in the chat that are available to you.
I'll throw them in there again in case anyone needs them. While I'm waiting for questions, I just want to say I have been working on co-creation and figuring that out in my context for years. So if you're brand new to simulation, I would not advise that you do simulation co-creation with your students is the first thing that you do. The certificates, that's low-hanging fruit, getting them to do certificates, getting them to do the self-debriefing, and then the group debriefing. And then even I've got the 3rd layer of debriefing on there. Like that's something I think is very achievable in a lot of different contexts, but this simulation co-creation with students does take a significant portion of class time. And it would be very uncomfortable if this was the first thing that I was doing in the class. I think I've been doing co-creation since like 2016 or so in different ways, not like this. Like I started with, let's make a rubric together.
That kind of moves along with is it universal design, where a lot of it is co-creation with the student to support also like accessibility issues. I have a colleague who does some work in that, and she is very much into the co-creation and mutually agreeing on outcomes and supporting that way.
So
There you go.
universal design for learning is really, to me, all about choice. The co-creation thing is about deciding what those choices are going to look like. I feel like it aligns really well with universal design. For me, I learned about co-creation through my work with eCampus Ontario related to open educational practices, which is something I didn't talk about in this presentation, because I feel like there is a point when there's a little bit too much theory. What would you say is the biggest challenge of using a participatory approach for teaching, such as critical pedagogy from Freire? The biggest challenge, I think, is that I'm working in a system where students are trained that the teacher is the expert. You jump the hoop that the teacher says. So I spend a lot of time trying to break down that power differential with the students in the class. I feel like for some reason, last year, it was a little bit faster than this year. It may have been because I taught them 2 courses the previous semester instead of 1, but it does take a lot of time. That's why I made it orange on the little slide where I was talking about the biggest challenges. Students usually end up appreciating it, but they're very uncertain about it at the beginning, in my experience. Just kind of in closing, as educators, I think it's really important that we listen to students and what students have to say about our courses and the assignments in them. If we're guiding students through co-creation, I think there's a lot of different things to balance, and you need to think about each person, and as educators we need to take responsibility for the overall learning in the project. So it's important for me as an educator to have time between the discussions in class and the decisions that I make. So I don't actually make them right away in the classroom. I take some time to reflect about on those as well. And then I'll send out an announcement or something. It was super helpful to have another professor to talk to with the Poverty Challenge co-creation. During each phase, Mel and I can bounce ideas off of each other. We can help each other deal with some of the group process issues, extenuating circumstances, providing feedback on the final product, and grading, which we were able to do together. That is something that doesn't usually happen in education. I feel like overwhelmingly the course has had a positive impact on students, as evidenced by the debriefs from last year, and I would do it again. Every time though, I'm probably going to do things a little bit differently, because I'm the kind of person that I try and plan to do it better the next time. So, you know, if we talk about this next year, it's probably not going to be the exact same as it was this year, although I do feel like this year was better. If you're thinking about co-creation or something like that, there are other things that you can do. You don't have to do something this big. I've done co-creation in terms of writing multiple choice questions with students, and then some of those might appear on their exam. You can do it with the content. That's a little bit less risky because it's not graded. Like, what readings are you aware of that you feel other students should look at, kind of thing. A little bit higher level is the co-assessment stuff, which I haven't had a chance to get into today. And for the purposes of my PhD, I'm looking at what are student and educator definitions, experiences, and distinguishing characteristics of co-creation when it's used with a whole class. So one of the things that I've noticed from looking at the literature is co-creation is usually isolated to smaller groups. Like a few of you might work on a publication with me and we're going to co-author something. But I'm really interested in what happens when you invite a whole class of students to engage. And so I'm going to be doing a scoping review, concept analysis, because the term co-creation is a little fuzzy, which I think is fine, but we need to define it anyways. And then phenomenography at some point in the future, where I'm actually looking for different experiences of students so that we can then improve the experience of co-creation for students in the future. And I have references. They're coming. Oh, they're there. I also handed out the references in the chat if you're interested.
Well, Laura, thank you so much for this great presentation. It certainly was a very innovative approach to experiential learning. It's really helped us to understand that concept of co-creation. So this has been really quite an informative presentation. And it really takes that co-creation to a different level. So thank you so much for your time. And thank you to everyone on the call today for joining us for this very innovative presentation. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye now.
Bye, thank you.